Life in Earth's oceans has always been fierce, full of monsters with teeth, tentacles, and crushing jaws. From Devonian sea scorpions to Jurassic marine reptiles, the rule was simple: stay out of the water if you want to survive. But for one brief window in deep time, the opposite was true. Welcome to the late Permian period, between 259 and 252 million years ago, the final chapter of the Paleozoic era, and a truly terrifying time to be a land animal. The name Lopangian might mean nothing to most, but it marks one of the strangest and most dangerous periods in Earth history. The final epoch of the Permian period, lasting from about 259 to 252 million years ago. During a Lopangian, Earth was nearly unrecognizable. Time itself was different. The moon orbited closer to Earth, making the days only about 22 hours long. Geography was alien as well. Most of the planet's land was fused into the supercontinent Pangaea, a vast dry mass that connected Africa, the Americas, Antarctica, India, Australia, and parts of Europe into one enormous block. To the east, there were still islands, though they were massive by today's standards. The largest landmass, not part of Pangaea, included present-day Siberia, Kazakhstan, and North China, while farther south lay another enormous island made up of South China and regions of Southeast Asia. Even future countries like Turkey, Iran, and Tibet were isolated island landmasses at this time, surrounded by ancient oceans, the Tethys Ocean and the Paleotethys, both of which were vast but still smaller than the truly enormous Panthalassa, a superocean that encircled all of Pangaea. Panthalassa was no ordinary ocean. It was the largest ocean Earth has ever known, a truly massive body of water that covered more than 60% of the planet's surface. That's more than double the size of today's Pacific Ocean. Imagine looking out at the sea and seeing nothing but water in every direction, for thousands of miles. No islands, no land, just a rolling, endless blue void. You might think such a huge ocean would be full of giant sea monsters. But surprisingly, the waters of Panthalassa and the other oceans during the late Permian, the Lopangian, were not as dangerous as you'd expect. In fact, they were pretty quiet. Sharks had already been around for over 200 million years by this time, and if you're familiar with the Permian period, one shark probably stands out in your mind: Helicoprion. This strange creature was about 26 feet long and is famous for one of the weirdest mouths in the history of life. A spiral of teeth shaped like a buzzsaw, all packed into its lower jaw. It's become one of the most iconic marine animals of the Permian. But here's the twist: Helicoprion had already gone extinct. The oceans no longer had any giants like it swimming around. Some of its smaller relatives were still alive, like Hebotus, a shark that reached only about 6.5 feet in length, about the size of a modern leopard shark. But these were not fearsome predators. Their teeth were made for eating soft, squishy animals like squids and jellyfish, not for crushing bones or shells. Other sharks swimming in the oceans included the sphenacanthids and hybodonts, but they were even smaller, around 3 feet long or less. They were fast and flexible, but they didn't pose much of a threat to anything larger than a shrimp. Another group that had once ruled the oceans, the Eurypterids, also known as sea scorpions, was also fading fast. These arthropods had been terrifying giants during the Devonian period, with some species growing bigger than a human. But by the Lopangian, they were nearly extinct. Only 2 known genera survived, and neither was large or powerful anymore. They were no longer predators at the top of the food chain, just survivors clinging to the last scraps of their former glory. Most marine life, in fact, was in trouble. The oceans were struggling. One of the main reasons was a major extinction event that had happened only about 2 million years earlier, known as the Capitanian mass extinction. It's not as famous as the one that killed the dinosaurs, but for marine life, it was even worse. Coral reefs collapsed, oxygen levels dropped, large parts of the ocean became toxic, dark, and empty. Life couldn't thrive the way it once had. Groups like trilobites, ammonoids, and sea scorpions were still around during the Lopangian, but barely. They were no longer diverse, no longer dominant. They were reduced to just a few species, and most of those were small and weak. So even though the oceans were huge, they weren't full of monsters. They were quiet, empty, and slowly dying. And while the sea might sound a little dull at this point, that's actually an important detail, because while things were struggling in the ocean, life on land was about to face absolute disaster. Just like in the oceans, the Capitanian extinction brought massive destruction to life on land. But unlike marine life, creatures on land managed to recover more quickly, and in many ways became even more dangerous than before. That's because the extinction wiped out many of the old land-dwelling rulers, especially a group called the Dinocephalians. These were large-bodied therapsids that had dominated much of the earlier Permian, With him gone, the stage was set for new predators to take over. The biggest winners of this shakeup were a terrifying group called the Gorgonopsids. First discovered in 1876, the fossils of these predators were so fierce and unsettling that scientists named them after the Gorgons from Greek mythology, monstrous creatures said to turn people to stone. And with just one look at their sharp, saber-like teeth, it's not hard to understand why. Even though there were many different species of Gorgonopsids, they usually shared a few key features: deep-set teeth, long, narrow skulls, strong, upright limbs, and most famously, long, knife-like incisors and canines. In fact, they were some of the first animals on Earth to evolve saber teeth, even before famous predators like Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. They looked a bit like big cats, but they were not mammals, or even related to cats. Like the Dinocephalians before them, Gorgonopsids were therapsids, more closely related to mammals than reptiles, but still not quite mammals themselves. When they first appeared around 265 million years ago, Gorgonopsids were actually quite small, no bigger than a human foot. They mainly hunted insects, small reptiles, and amphibians. But as time went on, each new species grew larger and more powerful. By the late Permian, after the extinction of the older dominant predators, some Gorgonopsids had become enormous apex hunters. The most terrifying of them all was Innostrancevia, the largest Gorgonopsid ever found. It wasn't just the biggest of its group, it was also the largest land predator of the late Permian. Some fossil evidence suggests that adult Innostrancevia could reach over 11 feet long and weigh more than 1,000 pounds, about the size of a full-grown bear. Though on average, most individuals were likely closer in size to modern tigers. But what really set Innostrancevia apart wasn't just its size. It was also how it was built. It had strong, long limbs, which made it surprisingly fast and agile. This gave it a serious advantage when chasing down large plant eaters. And once it caught its prey, things got ugly. Its upper canine teeth were 6 inches long, among the largest seen in any non-mammalian therapsid. These saber-like weapons were not only long, but also curved and serrated, meaning they could slice through skin and flesh with terrifying ease. One bite could cause huge blood loss and deadly internal injuries. We're still not entirely sure how Innostrancevia hunted. Some scientists believe it used tactics like Smilodon, going for the neck in a precise, fatal strike. Others think it used a more patient method, biting once, then letting the prey bleed out from the wounds while following it until it collapsed. Either way, neither method offered a pleasant ending. And you couldn't easily escape it either, because Innostrancevia had a massive range. Fossils have been found in areas that are now Africa, Asia, and European Russia, meaning it spread across a wide range of habitats. Even more impressively, this saber-toothed predator lived in all sorts of environments, from warm floodplains in South Africa to cold deserts in what is now Russia. In these harsher, colder environments, the only shelter came from small forests and shallow lakes. And the main plant life was made up of Glossopteris, a genus of extinct seed ferns that dominated the Permian landscape. Now, having one giant Gorgonopsid like Innostrancevia roaming across both hemispheres of the Earth would have already been terrifying. But the truth is, the late Permian wasn't home to just one. It had many. In fact, there were dozens of different Gorgonopsid species living at this time. A large number of them came from what is now European Russia, including smaller ones like Pravoslavlevia, and mid-sized predators like Suchogorgon. This meant that Gorgonopsids had completely taken over many ecosystems. No matter how big or small the local herbivores were, chances are there was a Gorgonopsid nearby, ready to hunt them. And if you thought Permian Russia was dangerous, then South Africa was even worse. That's because down there, a whole subfamily of giant Gorgonopsids had evolved independently from Innostrancevia. This group was called the Rubiginae, and although Innostrancevia was still the largest individual Gorgonopsid ever, the Rubiginae were on average the largest family of them all. The Rubiginae stood out due to a few special features. Strong, thick skulls, no parasphenoid bone, a part usually found in other therapsid skulls, frequent tooth replacement, and deeply serrated teeth, likely even more efficient at cutting than those of Innostrancevia. They were also stocky, muscular animals, with some species almost reaching Innostranczevia's size. One standout example was Rubiga atrox, a terrifying predator from what is now South Africa and Tanzania. It sometimes grew up to 10 feet long. Its size alone made it an apex predator, but its skull was even more terrifying. In some individuals, the skull made up over 15% of the total body length. That's huge! And recovered fossils show that these skulls were incredibly thick, with evidence of skull bossing, bony bulges that suggest these animals were built for heavy impacts, grappling, and taking down powerful prey. But interestingly, despite their terrifying look, Rubigia didn't have a super powerful bite. In fact, its estimated bite force was only around 715 newtons, just about 20% stronger than a modern wolf's bite. That may sound disappointing, but it really just shows how insanely sharp and effective their teeth were at slicing through flesh and hide. They didn't need brute strength. They were surgical killers. And just like Innistroncevia, Rubitia could have completely changed an ecosystem all by itself, but it was almost never alone. Fossil evidence strongly suggests that Rubigia shared its environment with other members of its subfamily. The Rubigianae included 9 known genera, ranging in size from medium to large, and many of them lived at the same time. This meant that the environment was absolutely packed with large saber-toothed predators. And it gets worse. It's now believed that Innistroncevia and members of Rubigianae coexisted in the same regions of South Africa during the late Permian. Given their similar size, strength, and build, it's highly likely that these two predators competed for the same food, and may have even fought with one another. So yes, this truly was the planet of the Gorgonopsids. Their sheer numbers, sizes, and deadly adaptations made life on land extremely dangerous. Compared to that, the relatively quiet oceans of the time probably felt like the safer place to be. But just in case you're still not convinced, there are even more nightmarish predators roaming the land during this period. One important group were the Therocephalians, another branch of the Rhapsids, like the Gorgonopsids, but with their own unique features. They first showed up during the Middle Permian, and while they didn't reach the same massive sizes, they were even more widespread and far more diverse. Some Therocephalians were even herbivores, but most were carnivorous predators that, at a glance, might have been mistaken for Gorgonopsids by an untrained eye. They too had large skulls, sharp teeth, and a similar overall shape, but there were key differences. Broader, deeper skulls, shorter, straighter teeth, more compact, stocky bodies. These Therocephalians also had more compact, stocky builds, and as we mentioned earlier, they were more diverse than the Gorgonopsids. This meant many of them evolved very different hunting strategies, some that the Gorgonopsids never used. In fact, a few of them may have taken things to an entirely new level. 2 small dog-sized
Therocephalians, Ichibangups and Eucambersia, are suspected of being venomous.
If this is true, it would make them the first known venomous tetrapods in Earth's history. That's a pretty huge evolutionary leap, and it would have made them extra dangerous to anything they hunted. But not all Therocephalians hunted the same way. Some, like the Ictidiosuchians, are often thought to have been semi-aquatic. Others were fully land-based and hunted large prey using strange adaptations, like saber-like teeth, as seen in a group sometimes called the Scylla of Swords. These creatures weren't afraid to experiment when it came to survival, but the one Therocephalian that truly stood out was Masocrinus. This predator was about the size of a jaguar, but with a head as big as a lion's. Its skull was massive compared to its body, and it was packed with long, conical razor-sharp teeth. That oversized head wasn't just for show. It likely gave Masocrinus a powerful bite. Based on fossil reconstructions, it probably hunted by pinning prey down with strong forelimbs, then delivering serious damage with its jaws. And this animal wasn't rare. It was one of the most abundant Therocephalians during the late Permian. It may have even taken over the role of apex predator in some areas, replacing Gorgonopsids, where they either declined or disappeared. But believe it or not, Moschornus wasn't even the biggest of its kind. That honor goes to Megaweitzia, a distant relative of Moschornus that lived in what is now European Russia during the early Lopingian, late Permian. This beast was around 9 feet long, making it the largest Therocephalian known so far. Fossilized feces, called coprolites, show that Megaweitzia likely preyed on large Cynodons. And there's more. Some scientists think that this predator may have been venomous too. Its skull has structures that could have housed venom glands in ducts, suggesting that it may have injected venom into prey while biting, similar to some modern snakes or venomous lizards. However, because most fossilized remains of its prey are in poor condition, it's hard to prove this for sure. So while it's an exciting theory, the idea of venomous Megaweitzia is still debated in the paleontology community. By now, it should be clear. The late Permian wasn't just chaotic, it was absolutely deadly. You had saber-toothed Gorgonopsids, venom-wielding Therocephalians, and even more strange predators waiting in the shadows. Because even that wasn't all. Other groups of carnivores were also roaming the earth, and they were just as strange, maybe even stranger. One of these groups were the Proterosuchids. These reptiles looked a bit like crocodiles, but were more slender and agile. Some were fairly large, and they had long, needle-like teeth designed to catch slippery or soft-bodied prey. Unlike the Therocephalians and Gorgonopsids, Proterosuchids were true reptiles, and some of them hunted on land, while others likely lived a semi-aquatic lifestyle. Fossils of these creatures have been found on almost every continent, except Antarctica and North America. And then came the armored Croniosuchians. These creatures were also crocodile-like, but with a twist. They were covered in thick, bony armor along their backs. This likely acted as protection against large predators, especially the heavy-biting Gorgonopsids and Therocephalians. Though we don't know much about their behavior, their strange appearance and widespread fossils show they were an important part of the food chain during the Permian. Members of this next group, the Croniosuchians, could actually vary quite a bit. Some were fully terrestrial, others semi-aquatic, and most were no bigger than a monitor lizard. But there were exceptions. One genus in particular, the Urolurpaton, could grow much larger, especially in what is now European Russia, where some individuals reached the size of a female American alligator. That's big enough to be a serious predator. And then there were the amphibians, or more precisely, their primitive ancestors. These early tetrapods were thriving across Pangaea, and in many areas, they were the main reason animals avoided fresh water altogether. Many of them had evolved into specialized ambush predators, lying in wait in the water for anything that came close to drink, bathe, or just make a mistake. Out of all these amphibian groups, the most terrifying were probably the Rhinosuchids. These creatures are thought to be close relatives of the ancestors of modern frogs and salamanders. They had 4 limbs, long tails, and bodies shaped a lot like giant salamanders or even crocodiles. The largest of them was Uranocentrodon, a monstrous 13-foot beast that lived in South Africa, right alongside the Gorgonopsids and Therocephalians. So if the predators on land didn't get you, the ones in the water might. Just a truly awful time to be a wandering herbivore. In European Russia, a different group of large amphibians called the Archegosaurids filled the same role. These were also tetrapods, but they were longer and more slender than the bulky Rhinosuchids. Some genera, like Melosaurus, could grow up to 10 feet long. Not exactly something you'd want to find lurking in a pond. With so many terrifying predators in both land and in water, it might seem like herbivores didn't stand a chance, but they absolutely did survive. And in fact, they were more diverse than the carnivores. Across huge regions of Pangaea, you would have encountered a wide variety of plant eaters. The Dicynodonts, Camptorhinids, and Parareptiles were just a few of the key players. One of those well-known herbivores from this time was Lystrosaurus, a stocky dicynodont that was about the size of a badger or a small pig. It had a strange squat body and powerful forelimbs, and it wasn't just for walking. Lystrosaurus may have used its limbs and tusks to dig deep burrows. These burrows would have been life-saving shelters from predators and extreme weather. In fact, burrowing wasn't unique to just one group. Another family, the Cynodonts, also evolved to dig tunnels, using their broad skulls to push dirt aside. These behaviors show how many herbivores started focusing on defense and escape, rather than fighting back. On the other side of the strategy spectrum were the Parasaurs, who decided that if they couldn't run, they'd just turn into tanks. These animals were massively built, with thick, heavy bones and large bony plates, or osteoderms, embedded in their skin. Some species even had skull spikes for extra defense. One of the most famous examples is Scutosaurus, which could weigh over 1.2 tons and grow as long as the biggest Gorgonopsids. Scutosaurus was slow and bulky, but its armor and muscle density made it extremely tough to kill. While this genus is only found in European Russia, the Parasaurs as a whole were found all over the world during the late Permian. Other important herbivorous groups included the Canemiriforms, the Rhopalodontids, and the Dinocephalians, each with their own unique adaptations for surviving the carnivore-dominated landscape. As wild as the late Permian world was, there was one thing that probably brought a bit of comfort. You didn't have to look up. Unlike the Mesozoic, which had flying reptiles and aerial predators, the skies during the Permian were still relatively empty. You only had to worry about what was on land and in the water. The biggest airborne animals were things like griffinflies and the Paleodictyoptera, massive insects with wingspans that could rival a crow, but they were harmless to large animals and not especially common. Their numbers had been drastically reduced following the Carboniferous rainforest collapse, and as a result, aerial life was relatively scarce. Among the few vertebrates to take to the air were the Wageltosaurids, a family of gliding reptiles. These creatures were about the size of a large bat, and while their leathery wings might have startled you, they posed no real threat. They were likely insectivores, spending much of their lives climbing or leaping through the treetops. Evolution had shaped them for arboreal agility, not sky dominance. But if you were expecting Earth to make up for quiet skies with calm terrain, think again. The real threat wasn't flying above. It was Mother Nature herself. Most late Permian life was confined to specific regions, mainly European Russia and parts of Africa. That's because large portions of Pangaea were simply too hostile for life. The global average temperature was around 35 degrees Celsius, twice what we experience today, and massive deserts sprawled across the equator, choking the land with drought and heat. Further north, the central Pangaean mountains stretched across the continent, creating extreme rain shadows, vast areas of unrelenting dryness. If such conditions existed today, it would be a climate catastrophe. But here's the chilling part. This wasn't even the worst of it. That came around 252 million years ago, with the arrival of the Permian-Triassic extinction event, also known, fittingly, as the Great Dying. This was the single most devastating extinction in Earth's history, triggered by an apocalyptic force, the eruption of the Siberian Traps, a region of volcanic hell in what's now Siberia, spanning an area roughly the size of Western Europe. These weren't your average volcanoes. They were relentless flood basalts, spewing lava flows over a kilometer thick and releasing catastrophic levels of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide. The result? A climate spiraling into chaos. Global temperatures skyrocketed. In some places, it got as hot as Death Valley during its worst months, but year-round. And if the heat didn't get you, the air quality might. These eruptions choked the skies with noxious gases, triggering widespread oxygen drops that led to hypoxia events across the planet. Some studies even suggest that the volcanic gases shredded the ozone layer, exposing the Earth to 5,000% more ultraviolet radiation in some regions.
The final toll? 57% of all biological families,
83% of genera, over 90% of marine species were wiped out. To put it into perspective, the more famous KT extinction, the one that ended the reign of the dinosaurs, killed off only around 17% of biological families. Even though life on land was a horror show, things in the oceans were somehow even worse. Rising ocean temperatures, acidification, and oxygen loss turned the seas into underwater graveyards. And oddly enough, if you jumped in the water, you wouldn't have boiled, but you might have enjoyed the heat. Sea temperatures during this event were likely similar to a jacuzzi. One more reason why the water may have actually felt safer than the land. For a moment. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like,